It started with a 1920s Meissen silk kimono that my goddaughter had tossed into a donation bin behind our boutique like a soiled rag, and I can still feel the grit of that dumpster lid under my fingers as I opened it up and pulled the fabric free. The scent of old camphor and silk dust rose off the garment, the same smell I had known for years in my restoration workshop. Inside its lining, I would find the original partnership agreement, written in her own hand and notarized, along with a warning that my late best friend had sewn into the fabric years before she died, a note that read, "She forges like her father, never sign alone. And I want you to know right at the top that today Ava hand-rolls hems in a studio I renamed Silk of Deceit, wearing a smock that says Tangled in Betrayal, and every single scarf we ship has a care tag printed with her federal fraud docket number. This is the story of how a $100 check for a serger unraveled a multi-million-dollar con, how a retired surgical nurse used suture scissors and a Barbie pin to take it all back, and how the woman who once called me Auntie Elaine ended up stitching restitution into every seam she sewed. My name is Elaine, and I spent 32 years as a circulating nurse in a Level 1 trauma center, the kind of place where you learn to read a person's vitals from across the room and thread a needle through a vein so fine it's almost invisible. I could suture a wound smaller than a pencil eraser, and I could tell if a patient was bleeding internally just by the way their skin changed color under the fluorescent lights. I poured my entire $121,000 nursing pension into a boutique called Scarlet Thread Studios, a little storefront on a brick-lined street that sold hand-painted silk scarves and did museum-quality vintage kimono restoration. My business partner was Ava, my goddaughter, the only child of my dearest friend Renata, who died of pancreatic cancer when Ava was 14. I had promised Renata I would raise her as my, and I did through high school and college and the opening of the shop. Ava had the charisma, the Instagram presence, the sharp smile for buyers who walked through the door while I worked in the back, hunched over a cutting table, repairing century-old silk with the same needle driver grip I had used in the ore. One detail that mattered more than I ever expected. In my nursing days I had cross-trained in sterile processing, which meant I could run a small ultrasonic cleaner and an autoclave, and I understood the microbiology of contamination control. And because my father was a locksmith, he had taught me when I was 12 how to pick a simple wafer lock, just so I could let myself into our apartment if I lost my key. I never imagined I would need that skill again, but when the time came, my hands remembered the rake and the tension wrench like a familiar suture pattern. Ava notarized a 50% stake in Scarlet Thread when we incorporated, and as a sweet gesture, one she insisted on writing into the founding documents, she promised to give my sister Meredith a hand-painted silk scarf every single birthday for the rest of her life. Meredith lives 3 states away, and every August she would receive a flat box tied with a ribbon, a scarf inside, and she would call me in happy tears because she could feel the love stitched into the hem. That detail, the scarf promise, was woven into our legal agreement like a hidden thread, and it would become the first piece of evidence that Ava was tearing the fabric apart for cash. The betrayal did not come with a death. It came on a humid Tuesday afternoon in late June, when I returned from a week at Meredith's house, helping her recover from a hip replacement. I had been away for exactly 8 days, and I drove straight from the airport to the shop because I missed the smell of silk and the quiet hum of my restoration station. I unlocked the front door and stepped into a room that felt hollow. Display stands stood bare. The glass counter where we sold our hand-painted scarves was empty except for a single envelope. The inventory ledger, a leather-bound book I had kept by hand since the day we opened, was missing from its shelf. I walked slowly through the workshop in the back and saw that my restoration tools were still there, but the rack of kimonos awaiting repair, the rack I had spent months building, was gone. The air conditioning rattled overhead, and I remember thinking that the room smelled like dust and photocopier toner. I opened the envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for $100, the memo line reading serger buyout, and a letter on Scarlet Thread letterhead. The letter stated that I, Elaine Hartwell, had voluntarily dissolved my partnership due to medical leave, that I was no longer capable of managing the business, and that Ava, as sole proprietor, had accepted an offer from Halcyon Resort Group for our entire restored kimono collection. The sale price was $690,000. The letter had my signature at the bottom, a loopy approximation that looked like a photocopy of a photocopy, with a slightly trembling edge as if the forger had tried to make it look shaky. I knew my own hand like I knew a heartbeat, and that signature was a counterfeit. I sat down on the dusty wooden floor, crossed my legs, and placed the check on my knee. I had been a nurse long enough to recognize the physiological wash of shock, the way your vision narrows and your skin goes cold, and I gave myself exactly 60 seconds to breathe through it before I started thinking. Within that same day, before I even had time to call my sister, Ava and her husband Derek showed up at my house. Derek is a corporate attorney who wears monogrammed cufflinks and calls waitstaff by their first names as if he is doing them a favor. He walked into my living room with his hands in his pockets and said, "Aunt Elaine, we're here to help you through the transition. You're clearly not capable of managing the business anymore. The good news is, we've already handled the sale." Ava nodded, holding a manila folder pressed against her chest. "I've got a simple release that just finalizes everything. It'll give you a monthly stipend, and you can live in our guest house. No more stress. We'll take care of you." The guest house was a converted garage apartment attached to their home in a gated community, and the offer was presented as an act of mercy. I saw the glint in her eye, the same one her mother Renata used to get when she talked about a poker bluff. I made a choice right then, standing in my own hallway with the taste of dust still in my mouth. I played weak. I let my hands tremble visibly and I said, "I'm not sure I understand. My memory has been so foggy lately. Could you give me a few days to think?" They exchanged a look that was meant to be sympathetic but landed like a ledger entry. Derek said, "Of course, take all the time you need. In the meantime, we'll finish clearing out the shop. Just the junk that nobody would want." I nodded and watched from the window as they loaded boxes into a rental truck parked on the curb. One of those boxes was labeled salvage, and it was filled with damaged kimonos that Ava considered unsellable, garments with tears or stains that she thought had no value. But inside that box, I caught a flash of deep indigo and silver embroidery, a 1920s Meissen silk kimono I had been restoring before I left. It had a long vertical tear in the lining, and I had been meaning to fix it with a blind stitching technique I had adapted from surgical wound closure. I stepped outside and asked, in my most frail voice, if I could keep a few sentimental things from the salvage box. Derek waved a hand and said, "Take what you want. It's all headed for the dump anyway." I carried the kimono into my house and laid it on my cutting table, and that single garment, abandoned as trash, became the fulcrum on which everything turned. Later that night, alone in the silence of my workshop, I turned on the bright overhead magnifying lamp and examined the kimono. The outside was stunning, with hand-painted chrysanthemums in silver and cobalt, but the lining was frayed along the left side seam. As I ran my fingers along the silk, I felt an odd stiffness near the left hip, a slight rectangular shape that did not match the drape of the fabric. I reached for my suture removal scissors, a delicate pair of iris scissors with curved tips that I had kept sterile for decades. I snipped the lining threads one by one, careful not to damage the outer silk, and folded back the flap. Inside, between the outer fabric and the lining, was a flat packet wrapped in acid-free tissue paper, sealed with a tiny dab of archival glue. I opened it with trembling fingers and found the original notarized partnership agreement, the one Ava and I had signed on the day we incorporated, with the raised seal of a notary public named Mrs. Cormier, who had since retired. The paper was crisp and legal, every clause intact, but tucked behind it was a thin slip of notepaper, yellowed with age, covered in handwriting I recognized immediately. It was Renata's hand, the looping cursive she used only when she was deadly serious. Her words read, "Elaine, if you ever find this, Ava has already tried to cheat you. She learned to copy handwriting from her father, she'll forge anything. This agreement is your shield. Do not sign in front of her without a witness you trust. I love you." I sat there for a long time, holding that note, feeling the weight of a woman who had foreseen her own daughter's betrayal, and planted a seed in the lining of a kimono a decade before any of this happened. The warning was specific and practical, not just a mother's lament but a tactical instruction. I thought about Ava at 14, sitting at the kitchen table while Renata taught her calligraphy for a school project, and I realized that Renata had been testing her even then. I folded the note carefully, placed it back in the tissue paper, and secured the original agreement in a fireproof document bag I kept for my nursing credentials. Then I called my sister Meredith and told her everything, and she said, "You taught me how to spot a counterfeit stitch." Use that. I did not sleep that night, but I did something better. I began to map out a plan. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that the people closest to you can sometimes be the ones who stab you with the smallest scalpel. The next morning I walked into the guest house carrying a small suitcase and a paperback novel, and I began the manipulation phase in earnest. The guest apartment was a single room above the garage, with a separate entrance and a small bathroom. It was clean and comfortable, decorated in beige and cream, and it had excellent acoustics. I discovered on the first day that if I sat on the closed toilet lid with the bathroom fan off, every sound from the kitchen below travelled up through the heating duct with startling clarity. I could hear the clink of coffee cups, the shuffle of mail, and every single phone call Derek and Ava made when they thought I was napping. Derek brought me a stack of paperwork on the second morning, a consent to dissolution form and a release of partnership interest that needed my signature. I let my eyes go unfocused, the way I had seen elderly patients do when they were overwhelmed by medical forms, and I said, "I'll look at this later, honey. I keep losing my reading glasses." I had actually scanned the documents on my phone and sent encrypted images to a retired colleague of mine, a forensic nurse who specialized in document analysis. She confirmed within hours that the signature on the forged dissolution was a cut-and-paste job from a birthday card I had sent to Ava when she turned 25. The serifs didn't match, the ink density varied, and the paper fibers under magnification showed evidence of a laser printer rather than a pen. I saved that analysis in a password-protected cloud folder and smiled at Ava every morning when she brought me toast. For 2 weeks, I played the part of the addled aunt while I listened through the vent. I heard Derek on the phone with a bank officer, his voice rising and falling like a man who had never been told no. "What do you mean the wire is on hold? We provided the dissolution. That's all you need. A partnership dispute. There is no dispute. She's an invalid." A pause, then his voice dropped. "Look, the original agreement is missing. We don't have it. But we have a notarized dissolution with her signature, and that should be enough." Another call came 3 days later, this time Ava, her voice frantic and tight. "The resort's legal team is asking for proof of buyout. They want a notarized joint dissolution and the original share agreement. I don't have the original. It wasn't in the sharp safe. I tore that place apart. It's gone." A long silence, then Derek's voice, calm and cold. "We'll have to get her to sign a new one. A retroactive consent. Just get her to the bank and push a pen into her hand. She won't know the difference." I wrote down every word in a small spiral notebook I kept hidden inside the hollowed-out spine of a hardcover Bible on the nightstand. I also began to catalogue their spending patterns. I heard Ava on the phone with a luxury furniture designer, ordering a custom dining table made of reclaimed oak, and I heard Derek discuss a timeshare purchase in the Catskills. They talked about a new Lexus, about a lake house closing, about a vacation to the Maldives that winter. All of this was funded, they assumed, by the Halcyon payout that was currently frozen in escrow. The escrow, I learned from a later call, contained a $100,000 deposit that Halcyon had already paid, and the remaining $590,000 sat in a bank-held reserve account, waiting for clearance that would never come if I could stop it. The undercover investigation began in earnest on a rainy Thursday, when I staged a household accident that would give me access to the one room I needed most, Derek's home office. I knew his routine. He left for his law office at 8 a.m. sharp, and Ava typically went to a spin class at 9:15. On that particular Thursday, they were both upstairs, Ava in the shower and Derek on a conference call with his firm. I carried a large glass vase filled with water and wilting hydrangeas through the living room and deliberately caught my toe on the edge of the Persian rug. The vase tilted, lunged out of my hands and smashed against the mahogany side table beside Derek's desk. Muddy water cascaded across the desk surface, soaking a stack of papers and dribbling down into the open wastebasket. I cried out, "Oh no, I'm so sorry." "I'll clean it up." Derek's voice floated down the stairs, distracted and annoyed. "Just use the paper towels in the kitchen, Elaine." I said I would, and I knelt on the floor, a box of paper towels beside me, and began to soak up the mess. But as I wiped under the desk, my eyes went to the wastebasket overflowing with shredded paper strips. The office shredder was a basic strip-cut model, not a cross-cut, and the strips were long and uniform, maybe half an inch wide, and as long as a page. I recognized immediately that they could be reassembled pixel by pixel. I stuffed a thick handful into a plastic grocery bag I had in my sweater pocket, then tucked the bag into the waistband of my pants, hidden under my blouse. Next, I turned my attention to the filing cabinet beside the desk, a 2-drawer metal unit with a small silver lock. I had seen it before, always locked, and I had noted that the keyhole was a simple wafer lock, the kind that uses flat metal wafers instead of pins. I had picked dozens of these as a teenager, practicing on old cabinets my father kept in the shop. I did not have a tension wrench or a rake, but I found what I needed in the laundry room off the kitchen, a bobby pin from my hair, and a small flat screwdriver used for tightening cabinet handles. I knelt in front of the cabinet, inserted the tip of the bobby pin as a tension wrench, applying a light rotational pressure to the plug, and then used the screwdriver to rake the wafers up and down. It took maybe 4 minutes of careful, silent manipulation, my fingers remembering the fine motor control I had used to suture arteries, and then the plug turned with a soft click. The drawer slid open, and I was staring at a folder labeled Scarlet Thread Merger Docs. Inside the folder was a carefully organized trove of evidence. The Halcyon Resort purchase agreement was there, a 20-page legal document with a sale price of $690,000 and a closing date that had been pushed back twice. The forged dissolution with my fake signature was clipped to a notary acknowledgement that Ava had stamped herself, and I saw that the notary logbook entry was backdated by 3 months. There were also bank statements from an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, held under a shell company called DT Holdings, and those statements showed quarterly transfers of $15,000 labeled as management fees, and a recent deposit of $100,000 from a loan. I flipped the page and found loan documents, a commercial line of credit taken out against Scarlet Thread's assets, listing me as the primary borrower. The signature on the loan was a forgery, a better one than the dissolution, but still not mine. The loan had been taken out 6 months earlier, and the $100,000 had been wired directly into Derek's personal checking account, used as a down payment on their lakeside condo. My social security number was on the application, and the income verification was fabricated. I photographed every page with my phone, making sure the camera's date stamp was visible, then closed the folder and returned it to the drawer exactly as I had found it. I relocked the cabinet, wiped the bobby pin clean, and walked out of the office with the soggy paper towels and my grocery bag full of shredded evidence. Back in my guest room, I locked the door and spread the paper strips on the floor. I borrowed a small light table from the workshop, a portable unit I used for tracing embroidery patterns, and laid a sheet of acetate over it. For the next 3 hours, I rebuilt the shredded documents using tweezers and surgical tape, inch by inch, like reassembling a torn medical chart. The fragments were from a draft of the dissolution agreement that Derek had typed, with handwritten edits in Ava's hand. One margin note read, "Make Elaine's signature look shaky, add medically incapacitated clause to the release." Another strip had the phrase, "due to cognitive decline and inability to manage financial affairs." They were building a narrative to have me declared incompetent, to institutionalize me if necessary, so they could access every asset I had. When the puzzle was complete, I mounted the strips on a piece of archival board and photographed it in high resolution. I needed an ally outside that house, someone with the authority to freeze assets and launch an investigation, and I found her through the bank. I called First Midwest Regional Bank from a burner phone I had picked up at a gas station near the interstate, using a script I had rehearsed until it sounded calm and factual. I asked for the wire transfer department and was connected to a compliance officer named Marion Carver, a woman in her 50s with a clipped, efficient voice and a reputation for catching fraudulent transactions. She told me that she had already flagged the Halcyon wire because the notary on the dissolution was Ava herself, which was a direct conflict of interest under federal banking regulations. The funds were on hold pending a review, and she had been trying to reach me, the other signatory on the original business account, for weeks. I explained the situation, reading from the original partnership agreement I had found in the kimono, and then I told her about the dead man's switch clause. The clause was something Renata had insisted on back when we were first drafting the business plan. It was inserted at her suggestion, a line of text buried in the boilerplate but legally airtight. In the event that either partner attempts to sell, transfer, or dissolve ownership without the express, jointly notarized consent of both parties, all interest in Scarlet Thread Studios LLC reverts solely and irrevocably to Elaine Hartwell. Marion was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "If you can produce the original document with that clause intact, the sale contract is legally void. The escrowed funds will be frozen, and we will file a suspicious activity report with FinCEN. Are you able to get it to me physically?" I told her I could, and we arranged a meeting at a diner outside town where I would hand-deliver a certified copy. She also told me that the Halcyon Group was cooperative and frustrated, and that their internal legal team was already questioning the validity of the dissolution. They had no desire to be entangled in a fraud case. The remaining $590,000 sat in a reserve account, untouched, and the $100,000 deposit was in limbo. Marion gave me a direct line and a burner phone of her own, and we began to coordinate. 2 days later, I inserted a USB data extraction tool, a small device about the size of a thumbnail, into the back of Derek's desktop computer. I did this at 5 a.m., while they were both still asleep, letting myself into the main house with the spare key they had given me for emergencies. The device was a plug-and-play imager designed for forensic acquisitions, something I had bought online after researching corporate espionage techniques. It took 80 minutes to clone his email archive, and when the light stopped blinking, I slipped the drive into my pocket and left without a trace. Back in the guest apartment, I opened the image file on my laptop and found a chain of emails between Ava and Derek that spanned months. One message from Ava read, "I can copy her signature perfectly. I've been practicing. We'll just say she had a psychotic break and signed everything during a fugue state. No one will question a retired nurse with no family around." Derek replied, "We need a doctor's letter. I know a guy. Just get the escrow released." I exported the entire chain to a cloud account and sent a summary to Marion, who forwarded it to the bank's legal team and the U.S. Attorney's Office. The maximum cruelty beat, the moment when any residual family loyalty I felt was extinguished like a candle in a vacuum, happened on a Friday afternoon. I decided to test them, to see if there was anything left in the girl I had raised. I faked a medical emergency. I knew the physiology of a vasovagal syncope episode, the sudden drop in blood pressure and the pallor, the way a person crumples as if their strings have been cut, and I rehearsed it in my bathroom mirror until it looked authentic. At around 2 p.m., I walked into the main house carrying a folder with the unsigned release papers they had been pressuring me to sign. I called out weakly, "Ava, I don't feel well," and I collapsed in the hallway clutching my chest, my knees buckling as I slid down the wall. My head lolled to the side and I let my eyes flutter half-closed. I had placed my phone set to audio record under the credenza in the hallway before I called out so the entire scene would be captured. Ava and Derek were in the kitchen, arguing over the escrow hold. I heard Derek say, "What's that noise?" And then their footsteps, the hallway floorboards creaked. I felt their presence above me and I braced for the check of a pulse, for a hand on my forehead, for the instinct I had taught Ava when she was 11 and scraped her knee. Check for breathing, check for bleeding, call for help. None of that came. Derek said, "Is she faking?" And Ava's voice came back, flat and disinterested, "Who cares?" I heard the folder slip out of my hand and then I felt her footstep beside my hip, not over my body but near it, and I heard the rustle of papers as she bent down. She grabbed the folder from the floor and she said, "Finally, the release is in here, let's go. If she's dying, the bank won't ask questions. She's just attention-seeking anyway." I heard Derek hesitate, a half-step pause, but then his shoes turned and followed her toward the garage. I lay there on the cold hardwood, feeling the vibration of the door slam, and I counted to 300 before I opened my eyes. I had recorded the whole thing. I had my answer. I gave myself 5 minutes to breathe, then I stood up, dusted off my clothes, and retrieved my phone from under the credenza. I called Marion and said, "I have the audio. I'm ready to trigger the reversion." She told me to come to the bank branch at 2 p.m., the next Friday, exactly 1 week from that day, and to bring the original documents. She said she would have federal investigators present, and that I should continue playing the role until the very end. The final week was a masterclass in self-control. I let Ava and Derek dress me in a soft beige cardigan on the morning of the appointment, and I let them lead me to the car like a confused grandmother who needed an elbow to steady her. I kept my head down and my hands folded, and I answered their questions with vagueness. Derek said, "We're going to finalize the paperwork you should have signed months ago. It'll all be legal and done. You won't have to worry about a thing." I said, "That sounds nice." Ava patted my shoulder and said, "We're doing this for your own good, Auntie." I smiled and said nothing. The bank branch was a nondescript building of beige brick and glass, and we were escorted to a conference room on the second floor. Marion sat at the head of a long mahogany table, dressed in a navy blazer, and beside her were 2 men in plain suits that I recognized immediately as federal agents from the Financial Crimes Task Force. They had laptops open, and one of them had a small portable speaker on the table, the kind used for playing audio evidence in depositions. Derek smiled broadly and pushed my chair in, then said, "We're here to sign the retroactive dissolution and consent release. Mrs. Hartwell is fully competent and has agreed to finalize the paperwork." He slid a pen toward me, and Ava placed her purse on the table with a satisfied click. That was when I lifted my chin, straightened my spine, and met Ava's eyes with a clarity that must have jolted her like a defibrillator charge. I said quietly and distinctly, Ava, I sutured your scraped knees, and I taught you to tie a silk scarf. I will not sign my life away for a woman who steps over my body to grab a purse. Ava's face went pale, then flooded with red. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Derek started to say something about coercion and undue influence, but Marion opened a manila folder and spread its contents across the table like a coroner displaying evidence. There was the original notarized partnership agreement with the reversion clause highlighted in yellow. There were photographs of the shredded documents I had reconstructed, the ones with the phrase cognitive decline. There were the loan documents with my forged signature, the bank statements from the Cayman account, the email chain with Ava's own words about copying my signature and claiming I had a psychotic break. And then one of the agents pressed a button on his laptop, and the audio of that hallway scene played into the room, Ava's voice ringing out clear and unmistakable. She's just attention-seeking anyway. The notary who had been summoned to witness the signing quietly packed her stamp into her bag and left the room without a word. Derek stood up and began a legal blabber about illegal recording and two-party consent laws, but the agent said, Sir, we have enough here for wire fraud, bank fraud, forgery, identity theft, and elder financial abuse. You are both detained pending federal charges. 2 uniformed officers entered from the lobby and stepped behind their chairs. Ava screamed at me, her composure shattered. You'll never see a dime, the business is gone, you're nothing without me. I looked at her with a calm I had learned in trauma bays and I said, No, honey, the business is mine. The reversion clause just triggered. You sold it so it all reverts to me. That was your mother's last gift to you and you threw it away. The aftermath was methodical, legally precise, and deeply satisfying. Federal prosecutors picked up the case because it involved interstate wire transfers, a fraudulent loan issued across state lines, and a conspiracy to defraud an elder. Ava and Derek were charged with multiple counts including bank fraud, identity theft, forgery, and conspiracy. The loan against Scarlet Thread was voided by the issuing bank once the fraud was documented, and I filed a detailed claim with all 3 credit bureaus to repair the damage to my credit history. The Halcyon Resort Group, after reviewing the evidence, not only apologized, but actually became a loyal client for restoration services, because they had a dozen other vintage kimonos in their properties that needed conservation. The $690,000 they had set aside was released from escrow and paid directly to me, the sole owner of Scarlet Thread under the reversion clause, and the $100,000 deposit that Ava and Derek had tried to access was clawed back and returned to the business account. I was able to buy back the entire kimono collection from the resort, and that collection now hangs in my studio, a monument to what patience can build. I renamed the studio Silk of Deceit Studio, because the name was a reminder and a marketing gold mine. True stories of betrayal and revenge, it turns out, sell scarves like nothing else. And as part of Ava's plea deal, the judge ordered her to complete 2,000 hours of community service, which I was allowed to supervise as the primary victim under a restorative justice program. She reports to my workshop every weekday at 7 in the morning, wearing a pale pink smock that I had embroidered with the words, Tangled in Betrayal. Her job is to hand-roll the hems of our silk scarves, a delicate, tedious process that requires a needle and thread and absolute precision. She sits at a table in the corner under a bright lamp, and she rolls each edge with a slip-stitch so fine it is invisible, and I oversee every inch. I make sure she examines the care tag that we sew into every scarf before it ships. That tag, printed in tiny block letters on cream fabric, reads, Scarlet Thread Designs LLC/Silk of Deceit Studio, handcrafted with 100% silk. Felony case 2, 23 CR 0781 JRG. My sister Meredith gets a scarf every August, and she pins the care tag to her bulletin board as a conversation piece. I still think about Renata's note, stitched into a kimono lining a decade before any of this happened, tucked into a garment that was supposed to be discarded as rubbish. She saw the greed in her own daughter, a hunger that could not be sated, and she tried to protect me from beyond the grave with a single thread of paper and a few sentences written in truth. It taught me that love and vigilance are not opposites, that the smallest scrap of evidence folded inside the right seam can save your entire life, and that the fabric of trust is something you weave yourself, day by day, stitch by stitch. Ava's hands are working off her debt one hem at a time, and every time I see that smock, I know that integrity is a textile that cannot be forged, no matter how skilled the counterfeiter. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Tell me in the comments. If you enjoyed this tale of silk-clad revenge and meticulous justice, do me a favor, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of betrayal unraveled thread by thread. Until next time, keep your seams tight and your signatures verified.